There are moments in history when reality fractures, not because of war, not because of revolution, but because truth becomes impossible to ignore. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding that moment. Leaders especially, because when truth finally arrives, it does not negotiate. It does not ask permission. It does not care about titles. It exposes. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I serve as the president of Burkina Faso, a country in West Africa where the soil is harsh, the sun is relentless, and yet the spirit of the people refuses to surrender. To many, leadership looks like influence. To others, it looks like prestige. To some, it looks like control. But leadership does not feel like any of those things when you are living inside it. It feels like weight. It feels like waking up with the knowledge that millions of lives are shaped by decisions made in rooms that most citizens will never enter. It feels like understanding that every document signed may echo for generations. I was not born into privilege. I was born into ordinary circumstances, among families who understood survival before ambition. People who measured success not by wealth, but by whether the next day would bring opportunity or struggle. In those early years, I learned something simple yet profound. Leadership is not about power. It is about responsibility. Over time, I watched my continent struggle beneath burdens that seemed both visible and invisible. Some wounds came from history, embedded in institutions long before our generation assumed control. Some came from external forces that viewed Africa not as a partner, but as a resource. But some of the deepest damage came from within, from leaders who forgot the purpose of the authority entrusted to them. Corruption was not an academic concept. It was not confined to policy discussions or economic reports. It was tangible. It was visible. It existed in unfinished hospitals, abandoned schools, and communities that waited for promises that never materialized. I saw farmers lose ancestral land through agreements they never understood. I saw young people grow up believing opportunity existed only in distant nations. I saw public funds vanish into systems designed to conceal rather than serve. International studies estimate that Africa loses more than $148 billion every year because of corruption. Numbers of that magnitude can feel abstract, but when translated into human experience, they become painfully real. They become mothers walking for hours in search of medicine that should have existed nearby. They become villages waiting for clean water systems that were approved on paper but never built in reality. They become roads that were announced with celebration, yet remain invisible beneath the feet of those who need them. These realities forced many African leaders to confront a question we could no longer avoid. How can a continent rise if its foundation is weakened by dishonesty? So a historic meeting was organized. On the 9th day of March, more than 40 heads of state and senior government leaders gathered in the city of Niamey in Niger. The meeting took place at the Sahel Governance and Leadership Center, a place created for conversations that would influence the direction of our region. The theme was direct, integrity and leadership in Africa. This gathering was not designed for ceremony. It was not meant to produce diplomatic photographs or carefully worded statements. It was intended to create reflection. The Sahel region has known instability, conflict, and poverty for decades. But increasingly, many of us had begun to understand that the greatest threat to our future was not always external. It was internal. It was dishonesty within leadership itself. To attend the meeting, I traveled nearly 1,000 kilometers. The journey required a coordinated convoy. Armored vehicles surrounded us. Helicopters moved overhead, scanning the vast terrain for threats that might never appear but could never be ignored. Such precautions are not signs of fear. They are acknowledgments of reality. Leadership in our part of the world exists alongside risk. The journey was expected to last approximately 4 hours, but the physical distance was only part of the challenge. In the days leading up to the conference, my schedule had been filled with discussions that seemed endless. Advisors spoke of strategic alliances. Military officials spoke of regional security. Economists spoke of financial reform. Diplomats spoke of international expectations. Every conversation carried urgency. Every decision carried consequence. By the time the convoy departed, my body already felt the quiet exhaustion that accumulates when responsibility becomes constant. As we moved deeper into the Sahel, the city gradually disappeared behind us. Paved roads gave way to long stretches of desert highway. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of sand and sun. Occasionally, villages appeared along the roadside. Small communities built from clay, stone, and resilience. I watched farmers already working beneath the rising heat. I saw children walking long distances with worn books pressed against their chests. These images remained with me. They reminded me that leadership is never theoretical. It is always personal. A signature on a government document can determine whether a village receives electricity. A private agreement can decide whether a school ever opens its doors. Inside the armored vehicle, the air was controlled, cool, detached from the harsh reality outside. Beyond the reinforced windows, the desert shimmered beneath waves of heat. The engines hummed steadily, their rhythm blending with the distant sound of helicopter blades. During the journey, I reviewed reports related to the conference. Documents detailing corruption across the continent lay scattered on the small table before me. One report stated that in many developing nations, more than 25% of public funds are lost through corruption and financial mismanagement. Statistics can feel distant, but their consequences are immediate. Imagine building 4 hospitals and watching one disappear into private accounts. Imagine a quarter of every national budget never reaching the citizens it was meant to serve. These thoughts weighed heavily on my mind. Hours passed. The horizon remained unchanged. The Sahel can be both beautiful and unforgiving. There are moments when the silence of the landscape feels almost sacred, as though the land itself observes your thoughts. It was during one of those long, quiet stretches that exhaustion finally took hold. Leadership is not only physical work, it is the constant burden of decisions, expectations, and moral responsibility. For days leading up to the conference, I had moved from one meeting to another without pause. Eventually, my body demanded what duty had postponed. Rest. I leaned back in my seat. The steady vibration of the vehicle made concentration difficult. Outside the window, the desert stretched endlessly beneath the blazing sky. Inside, the low murmur of radio communications blended with the persistent hum of machinery. I closed my eyes, intending only to rest for a moment. But fatigue has its own gravity. Slowly, imperceptibly, I drifted into sleep. And in that sleep, something began that would redefine everything I believed about power. At first, it felt like nothing more than a moment of quiet, the kind of shallow rest that happens when exhaustion overtakes discipline, a temporary surrender, a pause between responsibilities. I could still sense the motion of the convoy. I could still hear the distant mechanical rhythm of engines working against the endless resistance of the desert. But slowly, something began to shift. The sound softened, the vibration weakened. The familiar noises that had defined reality only seconds before began dissolving into something deeper than silence. It did not happen suddenly. It happened the way shadows grow at sunset, patiently, without permission. The radio voices faded first, then the hum of the engine, then even the faint thunder of helicopter blades above. It was as if the world itself had stepped away from me. The darkness behind my closed eyes deepened, becoming heavier, almost tangible. This was not the comforting darkness of sleep. It felt vast, boundless, as though I had been placed inside an emptiness that existed beyond physical space. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I became aware of presence, not a visible presence, not yet, but an awareness that something immense surrounded me, something that did not belong to ordinary experience. Far in the distance, a faint glow appeared. At first, it resembled the promise of dawn, a soft brightness at the edge of perception. But unlike dawn, this light did not bring comfort. It brought clarity. The air around me began to change. What had been neutral became warm. The warmth became heat. The heat grew intense. Breathing felt different, as though the atmosphere itself carried weight. When the darkness finally receded, the world I knew was gone. The desert road had vanished. The convoy no longer existed. The sky above me had transformed into something unrecognizable. It was red, not the red of sunset, not the red of firelight, but a deep, burning crimson that stretched endlessly across the horizon. Clouds moved slowly through that sky, thick and heavy, resembling smoke drifting over a battlefield long after the conflict had ended. The ground beneath my feet was fractured. Deep fissures split the earth in every direction. From those cracks, smoke rose steadily. Occasionally, flames burst upward with sudden violence before retreating again into the depths. The heat was overwhelming. It pressed against my skin. It filled my lungs. It seemed to exist everywhere at once. For several moments, I remained still, trying to comprehend where I had been taken. The silence was absolute, not peaceful, not calm. It was the silence that exists before truth is revealed. Then I heard something. At first, it sounded like wind moving across an empty landscape, but the sound grew stronger, more defined. It carried emotion, human emotion. They were voices, many voices. They echoed across the fractured terrain, rising and falling like waves crashing against jagged cliffs. But these were not ordinary voices. They were cries, cries filled with anguish, cries filled with regret, cries that carried the desperate tone of those pleading for mercy they feared would never come. The sound reached deep inside me, settling somewhere beyond thought. I began to walk. Each step felt deliberate, heavy, as though the ground resisted movement. With every step forward, the cries became clearer. Some voices were frantic, their desperation raw. Others sounded exhausted, as though they had been pleading for years without response. The smoke obscured my vision. Yet through the shifting haze, shapes began to appear. At first, they were only silhouettes against the burning horizon, figures standing motionless in the distance. As I moved closer, I realized they were not shadows. They were people. Some stood alone, isolated in their suffering. Others clustered together, as though searching for comfort that could not be given. None of them appeared free. Some were surrounded by flames that rose from the cracked earth beneath them. Others knelt as though carrying immense, invisible burdens pressing down upon their shoulders. A few seemed restrained by forces that could not be seen, their movements limited, their expressions trapped between realization and despair. The atmosphere was saturated with sorrow. Not chaotic sorrow, not random suffering, but sorrow that felt purposeful, as though this place existed to reveal something that could no longer be hidden. The ground trembled faintly beneath my feet. Smoke drifted in slow, deliberate currents. Then, suddenly, the light around me began to change. Until that moment, the landscape had been illuminated by the dull, red glow of the sky. But now another light appeared. It was subtle at first, a distant brightness that seemed almost hesitant. But it grew, rapidly, intensely. Unlike the harsh glow of fire or the merciless glare of desert sunlight, this light felt pure. It carried authority without aggression, power without violence. As the light spread across the broken land, something extraordinary happened. The darkness retreated, the smoke parted, the flames dimmed, even the cries softened. I turned toward the source of the light. It emanated from a single point beyond the fractured horizon. The brightness expanded until it illuminated everything. The red sky, the cracked earth, the suffering figures. Within that light, a form began to take shape. At first, only an outline, a human silhouette surrounded by brilliance. As the light intensified, the figure became clearer, defined, undeniable. The presence carried power. Not the power of domination, not the power of fear, but authority that felt absolute, compassion that felt infinite, truth that felt inescapable. The figure stepped forward, and as he moved, the light surrounding him pushed back the darkness across the land. The flames receded. The cries quieted. The very air seemed to acknowledge his arrival. In that moment, something within me understood before thought could form language. It was Jesus. The light did not blind me. It revealed me. It was not harsh. It was not violent. It was absolute. As the figure stepped closer, the landscape itself seemed to respond. The cracked earth stopped trembling. The flames withdrew into the fissures. The smoke parted as though carried away by an invisible wind. Even the cries that had filled the air moments before began to soften. Not because suffering had ended, but because something greater had arrived. He stood before me in a presence that could not be mistaken for anything human, yet felt more real than any reality I had ever known. His robe shone with a purity that did not belong to the physical world. The light surrounding him was not merely illumination, it was understanding. It was truth made visible. When he looked at me, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not fear, not shame, but exposure. It was as though every thought, every decision, every intention I had ever carried existed openly in that moment. There were no defenses, no titles, no power structures, no systems of influence, only truth. For a brief time, neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was sacred. It carried weight, yet also clarity. Then he turned his gaze toward the horizon where the suffering figures stood. "Look carefully," he said. His voice did not echo in the traditional sense. It did not need volume. It filled the entire space effortlessly, as though the land itself carried his words. Look and understand what power becomes when it is separated from truth. As he spoke, the light around him expanded. It moved outward across the fractured ground like sunrise overtaking night. The figures in the distance became clearer, their forms more distinct, their suffering more visible. What had once seemed like shadows now revealed themselves as individuals, human beings. Some stood surrounded by rings of fire that rose from the cracked earth beneath them. Others bent beneath invisible burdens so heavy they could barely remain upright. A few appeared bound by chains that glimmered with metallic brilliance. Gold, silver. Wealth itself had become their prison. Their faces were filled with anguish. Yet as I looked closer, something else emerged. Recognition. There was familiarity in their posture, in their expressions, in the symbols they carried. These were not ordinary individuals. They had once been powerful. Some had worn crowns. Some had commanded armies. Some had controlled economies that shaped the fate of millions. They were leaders. Leaders whose authority had once filled grand halls and dominated global conversations. Leaders who had been praised by crowds and defended by institutions. But here, none of those structures existed. Here, there were no speeches, no legal defenses, no political alliances, only truth. Jesus raised his hand slightly, and the light shifted again. Scenes began to appear in the air around us. Not vague impressions, not symbolic visions, but living memories, moments from the past unfolding with undeniable clarity. I saw a large office filled with polished wood and expensive art. A leader sat behind a massive desk, while businessmen placed a dark leather case before him. The case opened slowly, revealing stacks of currency arranged with calculated precision. The leader hesitated only briefly before nodding. Hands were shaken. Agreements were made. The scene dissolved. "That money," Jesus said quietly, "was meant to build clean water systems." Another image appeared. A conference room filled with officials signing contracts that transferred natural resources into foreign control. Oil fields, mineral deposits, forests. Entire regions negotiated in exchange for personal wealth. Behind the public ceremony, secret transactions unfolded. Bank accounts hidden behind shell companies. Funds transferred through distant financial systems. Millions diverted from national budgets. "Nothing hidden from the people," he said, "is hidden from heaven." Another scene emerged. A rural village. Children sitting beneath a tree because there was no school building. A teacher writing lessons on a piece of wood. Nearby, a mother carrying a sick child along a dusty road, searching for medical help that did not exist. Then another image appeared beside it. A luxury estate in a foreign country. Marble floors, private security, pools reflecting artificial light. The same leader had built both realities, one through theft, the other through neglect. The cries around us grew louder, not accusations, regret. We continued walking. Another figure appeared before us, wearing a crown unlike any royal symbol I had ever seen. It was thick, massive, formed from gold so heavy it forced his head downward. Every attempt to stand upright only increased the weight pressing against him. "Power was given to him," Jesus said. Scenes unfolded above the man, crowds cheering, promises made, resources sold in secret, wealth extracted from the land and transferred into private hands. The golden crown became heavier with every act of betrayal. Nearby, another group stood bound by chains of silver and gold. Their hands struggled to move. The more they resisted, the tighter the chains became. Their pursuit of wealth had become their confinement. As I observed them, I realized something else. They came from many nations. Some were from Africa, some from distant continents, some from countries considered wealthy and stable. Corruption had not respected geography. It had followed opportunity. Jesus turned toward me. "Leadership is not ownership," he said. "It is stewardship." The word echoed through my thoughts. Stewardship, to protect what belongs to others, to serve what has been entrusted. I understood then that this vision was not only about those who had already fallen. It was about those who still held power. Every president, every minister, every official whose decisions shaped the lives of unseen citizens. "Power used for personal gain creates suffering that cannot remain hidden forever," he said. "Sooner or later, truth appears." He stopped walking. "Now," he said softly. You must see the evidence. The light around him did not flicker. It did not shift with uncertainty. It expanded with purpose. As he spoke, the air itself seemed to transform into a living record. It was as if invisible pages were being opened before my eyes. Not symbolic pages, but precise accounts of human decisions that had once been hidden behind walls of power and silence. Scenes appeared one after another, clear, undeniable, unforgiving. The first vision formed slowly, like a memory rising to the surface of water. I saw a government office. Large windows overlooked a crowded city where life moved with urgency and hope. Inside the office, the atmosphere was calm, calculated. A leader sat behind a polished desk. Across from him stood several businessmen dressed in tailored suits that spoke the language of influence. Between them rested a dark leather briefcase. One of the men opened it carefully. Stacks of currency filled the case, neatly arranged, silent, persuasive. The leader's eyes moved across the money. For a moment, hesitation flickered across his expression. Then ambition replaced it. He nodded. Hands were shaken. Documents were signed. The case was closed. The scene dissolved. That money, Jesus said, his voice calm yet unyielding, was meant to build clean water systems. Another image emerged. A long conference table surrounded by officials who spoke confidently of progress and development. Contracts lay before them, agreements involving oil fields, mineral reserves, and agricultural land. The language of the documents was sophisticated, carefully constructed. But the truth behind them was simple. The nation would receive little, foreign interests would gain much, and certain leaders would receive personal compensation deposited quietly into distant financial accounts. Numbers appeared in the air, account balances, transaction histories, complex networks of shell companies designed to obscure ownership. Some accounts held millions, others held hundreds of millions. All of it hidden from the people who had trusted their leaders. Nothing hidden from the people, he said, is hidden from heaven. Another scene unfolded. A rural village, simple homes made from clay and timber, children sitting beneath a tree, holding worn notebooks. There was no school building, no structured classroom. A teacher attempted to write lessons on a rough wooden board. Nearby, a mother carried a child whose breathing was shallow and strained. She walked along a dusty path, searching for medical help that existed only in political speeches. Then another image appeared beside it. A luxurious estate in another country. Marble floors reflecting artificial light. Landscaped gardens maintained by hired workers. Security guards stationed at gates that separated wealth from reality. The same leader had created both worlds, one through theft, the other through neglect. The cries surrounding us intensified. They were not accusations shouted in anger. They were echoes of realization. Regret spoken too late. Another scene emerged. A private jet landing at night on a remote runway. Inside a luxury hotel, officials met in rooms where agreements were reached without transparency. Deals were negotiated that transferred national wealth into private hands, while public institutions remained underfunded. Then I saw rows of filing cabinets, each cabinet filled with documents, each document representing a decision that had altered the fate of thousands of people. Bribes, misused funds, contracts that prioritized profit over human welfare. Every action left a trace. Every decision created consequence. And in this place of judgment, those traces had become evidence. Nothing could be erased. Nothing could be rewritten. The light surrounding Jesus made every truth visible. I turned slowly, looking across the vast landscape again. The leaders who stood suffering appeared smaller now, not because their punishment had intensified, but because their illusions had disappeared. In life, they had hidden behind influence, behind wealth, behind institutions designed to protect reputation. Here, none of those defenses existed. Jesus looked toward me once more. "The suffering of the poor speaks louder than the excuses of the powerful," he said. The words settled into my mind with undeniable clarity. This vision was not merely revealing individual crimes. It was exposing a pattern repeated across nations and generations. Power entrusted for service had been transformed into opportunity for personal gain. Yet the message was not only about condemnation, it was also about warning, because as long as leaders still walk the earth, there remains the possibility of change. He turned toward the distant horizon. "The warning must be heard," he said. The air grew still, the cries softened. Something deeper was about to be spoken. The land grew quiet. Not silent in the way of emptiness, but quiet in the way a courtroom becomes still before a verdict is spoken. The cracked ground stretched endlessly across the horizon. Smoke continued rising from deep fractures in the earth. But even the flames seemed to hesitate, as though they too were listening. Jesus stood facing the vast landscape of consequence. The light surrounding him did not erase the scars of that place. It illuminated them. Every fracture, every shadow, every suffering figure remained visible under its brilliance. "Truth does not erase history," he said. "It reveals it." Then he turned toward me. There was seriousness in his eyes, but not anger. Compassion existed within that seriousness, as though the purpose of revelation was not destruction, but awakening. "Listen carefully," he said. "What I tell you must be carried back to those who still lead." His voice was calm, yet every word carried the weight of eternity. "This message is not only for those you see here, it is for those who still have time to choose differently." The air grew still. Even the distant cries seemed to soften as he continued. "The first warning," he said, "is about power." He paused, allowing the meaning of the word to expand beyond its political definition. Power is not ownership. It is responsibility. The statement echoed across the fractured land. Many leaders, he explained, come to believe that authority grants them control over people and resources. They begin to think of nations as possessions rather than communities. They assume that influence protects them from accountability. But leadership was never meant to belong to one individual. Power is entrusted. It is given so that others may be protected, so that systems may be strengthened, so that future generations may inherit stability. He gestured toward the suffering figures wearing crowns and chains. "Every leader answers to the people they serve," he said. "But beyond that, they answer to God." This truth had been forgotten by many. Some believed that once they left office, their actions would fade into history. Others believed that wealth could conceal their decisions indefinitely. But time does not erase truth, and power does not remove responsibility. "The second warning," he continued, "is about corruption." His voice grew heavier, not with anger, but with sorrow. Corruption is not only theft, it is destruction. He explained that corruption does more than enrich individuals. It weakens the foundation of entire nations. When public funds are diverted, schools remain unfinished. When natural resources are exploited unfairly, communities lose opportunity. When leaders prioritize personal wealth, trust between citizens and institutions collapses. And once trust collapses, rebuilding it becomes one of the most difficult tasks any society can face. He looked toward the distant horizon. Sometimes one corrupt leader can make an entire country poorer. The truth of those words was visible in the landscape around us. The third warning, he said, is about the future of Africa. At those words, my attention sharpened. He looked directly at me. Africa will rise, he said, but only when its leaders remember who they serve. He spoke of the continent's immense potential, vast mineral reserves, fertile agricultural land, young populations filled with creativity and ambition. Yet despite these advantages, many nations had struggled to transform wealth into prosperity. The reason, he explained, was not always lack of resources. Often, it was lack of integrity. When leaders place themselves before their people, progress slows. When leaders govern with honesty, nations grow stronger. The future of Africa, he said, will not depend only on technology or foreign investment. It will depend on character, on integrity, on the courage to resist corruption. He allowed silence to settle across the land. The suffering figures remained visible, living reminders of what happens when those warnings are ignored. Those who lead today still have a choice, he said. Some will listen, others will not. But every leader will one day stand before truth. The light surrounding him grew brighter. I understood that the vision was nearing its conclusion. Soon I would return to the world of the living, and a message would have to be spoken. The light intensified. It did not simply brighten the land. It consumed it. The cracked earth, the rising smoke, the distant figures burdened by their past decisions. All of it began dissolving beneath an expanding brilliance that felt both overwhelming and strangely peaceful. The cries faded. The oppressive heat receded. The heavy silence that had defined that place softened into something that felt almost like release. Jesus looked toward me one final time. There was no anger in his expression, no condemnation, only a depth of seriousness that carried both warning and compassion. The warning has been shown, he said. The message must now be spoken. His words did not feel like a suggestion. They felt like responsibility. The brightness expanded again, and the landscape of judgment dissolved completely, like mist disappearing beneath the first light of morning. The suffering figures grew distant. The fractures in the earth vanished. The red sky faded into pure light. Then something else began to return. At first it was faint, a vibration, a mechanical hum, a sound I recognized. The engine. The light collapsed into darkness, and my eyes opened. For a moment I did not move. I was back inside the armored vehicle. The familiar interior surrounded me. The reinforced seats. The small table with documents resting exactly where I had left them. The quiet radio communication from the front of the convoy. The steady motion of the vehicle continuing across the desert road. Outside the window, the Sahel landscape stretched beneath the blazing afternoon sun. Everything appeared normal, yet nothing felt the same. I sat upright slowly, taking a deep breath. My heart was beating faster than usual, not from fear, but from the intensity of what I had experienced. Had I truly slept only a few minutes? The convoy had not stopped. The helicopters still moved overhead. The journey toward Niamey continued exactly as planned. But the vision remained vivid, the red sky, the fractured earth, the leaders burdened by the weight of their decisions. The words that had been spoken. Power is responsibility. Corruption destroys nations. Integrity determines the future. I turned and looked out the window again. The desert rolled past quietly. In the distance, villages appeared as small clusters of resilience in an unforgiving environment. Simple homes, modest farms, people living lives defined by hope as much as hardship. Those were the people leadership was meant to serve. Those were the lives shaped by decisions made in distant offices. The convoy continued forward. Soon, one of the security officers in the front seat spoke into the radio. "We are approaching the Sahel Governance and Leadership Center." I looked ahead through the windshield. Buildings began to appear on the horizon. The city of Niamey was near. The historic gathering of African leaders was about to begin. But as we approached the conference complex, something inside me became clear. The vision had not been shown by accident. It was a message, and within hours, I would be standing in a room filled with more than 40 leaders whose decisions would influence the future of millions. I closed my eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to reflect, because the words I would speak would not come only from political strategy. They would come from truth that had been revealed. By the time the convoy entered the grounds of the Sahel Governance and Leadership Center, the afternoon sun stood high above the city. The complex was modern yet modest, built to serve as a space where regional leaders could confront the challenges shaping our continent. Security teams guided vehicles into position. Helicopters circled overhead before gradually departing. When the convoy stopped, I stepped out and felt the dry heat of the Sahel wind against my face. Flags representing multiple African nations moved gently in the breeze. Delegations had already begun arriving. Officials walked through the courtyard engaged in quiet conversations that carried urgency. Something important was about to happen inside those walls, and I knew that the message I carried could not remain unspoken. The conference hall was prepared with precision. Long tables formed a wide circle, designed so that no leader would sit above another. Microphones were positioned carefully. Translation devices rested beside neatly arranged documents. Flags stood in quiet rows, symbols of nations bound together by geography, history, and responsibility. More than 40 leaders were present. Presidents, prime ministers, ministers, advisors. Each carried the authority to influence the lives of millions. As the session began, the atmosphere felt formal yet restrained. Opening statements focused on policy frameworks, financial systems, and international cooperation. Technical language filled the room. Data was presented. Statistics were debated. The conversation was intelligent. But something deeper remained unspoken. As I listened, the vision I had experienced during the journey remained vivid in my mind. The fractured earth, the burdened leaders, the evidence revealed under light that could not be manipulated. Eventually, the moment came when I was invited to speak. I stood slowly. The room grew quiet, not out of ceremony, but anticipation. Many of those present had known me through political interactions. They expected a strategic address, perhaps a firm call for reform, perhaps a diplomatic summary of regional challenges. Instead, I allowed silence to settle before speaking. "My brothers and sisters," I began, my voice steady, "we have gathered here to discuss integrity." Interpreters translated my words into multiple languages across the hall. "But integrity is not only a political concept," I continued. "It is a moral responsibility." I spoke about leadership not as an entitlement, but as a duty. I reminded the room that authority without accountability becomes dangerous, that power without transparency eventually undermines the very institutions it seeks to control. Then, I shared a truth that had become undeniable to me. There will come a day when every leader must answer for the decisions they make. The hall remained silent. Some leaders leaned forward slightly. Others looked down at the documents before them, as though reconsidering the meaning of statistics that had previously felt distant. I did not describe the vision in detail. I did not speak of flames or fractured land. Instead, I spoke of consequences. Corruption is not merely a political error, I said. It is a moral failure that harms entire nations. I explained that when public funds are misused, leaders are not simply redirecting money. They are redirecting opportunity. They are removing education from children, healthcare from the sick, stability from future generations. I reminded the room of a sobering reality. In many developing nations, more than a quarter of public budgets disappear through corruption and mismanagement. That money could build roads, it could establish schools, it could create industries. Instead, it often disappears into systems designed to conceal rather than serve. As I spoke, I observed subtle changes in expression. Some nodded slowly, others remained still, reflecting. Then I delivered the message that had taken shape within me. Leadership is not ownership of a nation, I said. It is stewardship of the people. I paused before continuing. If Africa is to rise, it will not happen because of speeches. It will happen when leaders place the people before themselves. Silence followed. It was not the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of reflection. For several moments, no one spoke. Then, gradually, the discussion resumed. But the tone had changed. One senior leader acknowledged that corruption had weakened institutions across multiple countries. He spoke not defensively, but honestly, recognizing that even well-intentioned administrations can inherit systems shaped by decades of dishonesty. Another leader emphasized transparency in government finances. She argued that corruption thrives in darkness, and that citizens must be able to see how national resources are managed. A third leader spoke of protecting Africa's natural wealth, minerals, forests, agricultural land, not only for present populations, but for future generations. The conversation deepened. Technical language gave way to moral consideration, integrity, accountability, trust. These words began appearing repeatedly. One leader observed that Africa is among the richest continents in natural resources, yet many of its citizens continue to experience poverty. That contradiction, he argued, must be addressed through systemic reform. Another noted that corruption does not only damage economies, it erodes public confidence. And when citizens lose trust in institutions, instability often follows. For the next hour, the discussion extended beyond policy proposals. Leaders spoke of principles. They asked how systems could be designed to make corruption more difficult to conceal, how institutions could be strengthened so that public funds reached their intended purpose. Eventually, a proposal was presented. It called for increased cooperation among Sahel nations in combating corruption, shared oversight mechanisms, more transparent reporting of national budgets, stronger protection for public resources. It also emphasized something essential. Integrity must become a cultural expectation, not only a legal requirement. After further deliberation, the proposal was accepted. It was not a perfect solution. No single agreement can resolve challenges built over generations, but it represented acknowledgement that corruption must be confronted. As the session concluded, the atmosphere in the hall felt different from when it had begun. The conversation had moved beyond technical considerations. Something more profound had entered the room. Responsibility, reflection, perhaps for some renewal. Sadat leaders remained afterward, speaking quietly in smaller groups. Some approached me personally. One admitted that the discussion had reminded him why he first entered public service. Another acknowledged that leadership can tempt individuals to forget the people they serve. One leader offered a simple statement I would never forget. "Power is temporary," he said, "but the consequences of our decisions are not." As I left the conference hall that evening, the sun was setting over Niamey. The sky above the Sahel turned deep orange, then gradually softened into twilight. The vision I had experienced during the journey remained vivid, but now something else accompanied it: hope. Because despite the challenges, the future of Africa was not yet written, and every leader still had the opportunity to choose integrity. That evening, after the final discussions had ended and the conference hall had slowly emptied, I remained alone for a while. The sun had already disappeared beyond the horizon of Niamey. The Sahel sky transformed into deep shades of purple and indigo, and a quiet wind moved across the open land surrounding the conference center. Leadership rarely allows time for silence, but silence is often where truth becomes loudest. I sat there reflecting on everything that had unfolded: the long journey across the desert, the exhaustion that had overtaken me in the convoy, the vision that revealed a place where nothing could be hidden, the words that had been spoken. Power is responsibility. Corruption destroys nations. Integrity shapes the future. Those words were not meant only for the leaders who had gathered that day. They were meant for the world, because corruption is not confined to one continent. It is a human problem. It appears wherever authority exists without accountability. It thrives wherever individuals forget that leadership is meant to serve others. But the opposite is also true. Where integrity exists, nations grow stronger. Where honesty guides leadership, trust develops between citizens and institutions. Where resources are protected rather than exploited, generations benefit. Africa stands at a significant moment in its history. Our continent holds extraordinary potential. Vast agricultural lands capable of feeding millions, mineral resources essential to global industries, a young population filled with creativity, ambition, and resilience. The future of Africa does not have to be defined by poverty or conflict. It can be defined by opportunity. But opportunity requires leadership that places people first. Leadership that rejects corruption. Leadership that understands power is temporary while responsibility is enduring. The vision I experienced showed what happens when leaders forget that truth. But it also carried another message. Every leader still has a choice. Even now. Even today. A leader can choose honesty over greed, service over personal gain, courage over silence. The future is shaped by those decisions. And those decisions do not begin only in presidential offices or ministerial councils. They begin in the daily actions of individuals, citizens, teachers, workers, parents, young people preparing to become the next generation of leaders. Societies grow stronger when integrity becomes a shared value. Nations grow stronger when leadership remembers its purpose. My hope is that the message shared here encourages reflection rather than fear. Because the purpose of warning is not punishment. It is change. The world does not need perfect leaders. But it needs leaders who are willing to choose what is right even when it is difficult. Leaders who remember the vulnerable. Leaders who protect the future. Leaders who understand that authority is a trust given for a limited time. One day, every leader will stand before truth. As I left the conference center that night, I looked once more across the quiet landscape of the Sahel. Stars had begun to appear above Africa, silent witnesses to decisions made beneath them. In that moment, I felt both responsibility and hope. Because the future of our continent, and indeed the future of our world, has not yet been written. It is still being shaped by the choices we make today. If you have listened to this story until this moment, I invite you to reflect on it. Discuss these ideas, challenge them, share them. Because conversations about integrity and leadership must continue far beyond one conference hall. The more people engage with these truths, the stronger our collective future can become. Before I close, allow me to speak with clarity and conviction. I do not speak from pride. I speak from responsibility. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and the message I have shared is a message of truth. There is something people rarely talk about when they speak of power. They talk about strategy. They talk about elections. They talk about influence, alliances, economics, military strength, global positioning. But they rarely talk about time, because time is the only force that eventually strips power of its illusion. Every empire has believed itself permanent. Every system has believed itself justified. Every leader has believed, at some point, that the consequences of their decisions could be controlled. But time does not negotiate with ambition. It reveals it. As I stood beneath the quiet Sahel sky that night, watching the first stars emerge over the vast darkness of the African horizon, I understood something with absolute clarity. History is not shaped only by events. It is shaped by character. It is shaped by the silent decisions leaders make when no one is watching. It is shaped by whether integrity becomes a burden or a compass. It is shaped by whether power is treated as an opportunity or a responsibility. The vision I experienced was not about fear. It was about perspective. Because fear can control behavior temporarily, but truth transforms direction permanently. For generations, the world has often viewed Africa through the lens of struggle, conflict, poverty, instability. But what many fail to see is that Africa is also a continent of endurance, of resilience, of untapped potential that continues to survive despite systemic challenges. We are home to some of the world's most valuable natural resources. We are home to one of the youngest populations on Earth. We are home to cultures that understand community in ways modern societies are only beginning to rediscover. Yet potential alone does not create progress. Integrity does. A nation rich in resources but poor in leadership will remain trapped in cycles of dependency. A nation with limited resources but strong moral governance can transform its future in ways that surprise even its critics. The difference is not always economic. It is ethical. There is a dangerous misconception in modern politics, not only in Africa, but globally. The belief that leadership is primarily about control, about maintaining authority, about surviving opposition. But true leadership is about stewardship. It is about protecting what does not belong to you. It is about managing systems that must outlive your term. It is about making decisions that benefit people who may never know your name. The tragedy of corruption is not only financial, it is generational. When a leader diverts public funds, they do not merely alter budgets. They alter the trajectory of children who will grow up in environments shaped by those missing resources. They alter educational outcomes, healthcare access, economic mobility. They alter destiny. And destiny, once disrupted, requires decades to restore. The world today stands at a crossroads defined by unprecedented technological advancement and equally unprecedented moral complexity. Nations are interconnected in ways history has never experienced. Information moves faster than accountability. Wealth accumulates faster than ethical frameworks can regulate it. In such a world, leadership must evolve, not toward greater control, but toward greater transparency. not toward greater authority, but toward greater humility. Humility is often misunderstood as weakness, but humility is what allows leaders to recognize that power is temporary while consequences are enduring. Every generation inherits systems created by those who came before. Some inherit prosperity, others inherit dysfunction. The question facing modern leadership is simple yet profound. What will we leave behind? Infrastructure can be rebuilt. Economies can be restructured. Policies can be revised. But trust, once broken, is the most difficult institution to restore. Trust is invisible, yet it determines the strength of every visible structure in society. A nation without trust cannot sustain democracy. A government without trust cannot implement reform. A leader without trust cannot inspire unity. This is why integrity is not merely a personal virtue. It is a strategic necessity. The vision I witnessed revealed the ultimate reality that all leaders eventually face. Not political opposition, not historical criticism, but truth. Truth does not depend on popularity. Truth does not rely on public perception. Truth exists beyond narratives, and one day every individual entrusted with authority will confront it without intermediaries. This realization is not meant to paralyze action. It is meant to guide it. Because awareness of accountability creates responsibility. Responsibility creates restraint. Restraint creates sustainability. If the world is to move toward a future defined by cooperation rather than conflict, by development rather than exploitation, leadership must undergo transformation that is both institutional and internal. Policies matter. Systems matter. But character matters more. The future of Africa, and indeed the future of the global community, will not be determined solely by economic indicators or geopolitical strategies. It will be determined by whether leaders choose integrity when corruption offers convenience, whether they choose service when self-interest promises comfort, whether they choose courage when silence ensures survival. As I reflect on the journey that brought me to that moment, the desert road, the silence, the vision, the conference, the conversations that followed, I recognize that the message I carry is not unique to one nation or one region. It is universal. Every society faces the temptation to prioritize immediate gain over long-term stability. Every system encounters individuals who view authority as entitlement rather than obligation. But every generation also produces leaders who redefine what is possible through ethical conviction. The responsibility does not belong only to presidents or ministers. It belongs to citizens who demand transparency, to educators who cultivate critical thinking, to journalists who pursue truth, to young people who refuse to normalize corruption. Cultural expectations shape political realities. When integrity becomes non-negotiable within society, corruption loses its foundation. As the night deepened and the Sahel sky filled with stars that had witnessed centuries of human ambition, conflict, and transformation, I felt both the gravity of responsibility and the presence of possibility. The future is not predetermined. It is negotiated through decisions made daily by individuals who may never appear in history books, but whose actions influence collective outcomes. If there is one lesson I carry forward, it is this. Leadership is not measured by the duration of authority. It is measured by the legacy of decisions. Empires rise and fall. Policies are enacted and repealed. Reputations are constructed and dismantled. But the consequences of leadership endure. The world does not need leaders who are flawless. It needs leaders who are conscious. Conscious of their impact. Conscious of their accountability. Conscious that power is a temporary assignment, not a permanent identity. If this message reaches you, whether you hold public office, lead an organization, guide a family, or simply shape your own path, understand that influence exists at every level of human experience. Integrity is not a political ideology. It is a human obligation. The vision I experienced was not an ending. It was an invitation to reconsider what leadership truly means, an invitation to recognize that the future is shaped not only by what we build, but by how we build it, an invitation to choose responsibility over illusion. I speak these words not as a declaration of moral superiority, but as acknowledgement of shared vulnerability. Because every individual entrusted with authority faces moments of decision that define their legacy. And in the end, legacy is not determined by applause. It is determined by truth. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and the message I carry is simple. Power is temporary. Responsibility is eternal.